On a frozen winter afternoon, they thought no one would stop them. 3 rich bullies circled a woman in a wheelchair, mocking her, blocking her path, laughing as if the cold had erased consequences. When her loyal dog stepped forward, silent but protective, one of them kicked him hard enough to make him cry out in pain. She couldn't stand. She couldn't run. All she could do was watch, helpless, as cruelty took its time. What they didn't see was the old man standing across the street, watching, remembering who he used to be. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, subscribe now, because what happens next, they never expected. Snow fell in thick, slanting sheets over the 2-lane road outside Willow Creek, Montana, turning the world into a muffled white corridor where every sound felt far away. Frank Walker kept both hands on the wheel and drove like the storm was listening. He was 62, broad-shouldered in a way that didn't quite match the carefulness of his movements, and his face carried the carved angles of a man who'd spent decades squinting into glare. Sun-off windshields, fluorescent lights in hallways, the hard shine of danger. His hair had gone mostly iron gray, cropped short out of habit, and a neat trimmed mustache sat over a mouth that rarely wasted words. When he glanced down at the speedometer, his eyes, pale blue, alert even when tired, flicked back up immediately, sweeping the road the way they always had. The habits were older than the scars. The scars, though, had a way of speaking now that the badge was gone. The sternum incision from last year's surgery had healed clean, but the cold made it ache deep inside, as if winter could reach into his chest and remind him the pump was no longer something he could take for granted. His left knee throbbed where an old cartilage tear lived, and his right shoulder, the one he'd dislocated on a raid 20 years ago, tightened whenever he turned the wheel too sharply. On the passenger seat, Frank's black knit cap and an orange pharmacy bag sat beside a folded wool blanket. On the floorboard, a stainless steel water bowl rattled softly with each bump. In the back, Duke raised his head at the sound of it, then settled again with a slow, controlled exhale. Duke was a German shepherd, 11 years old by Frank's best guess, and built like a retired athlete who still took pride in showing up. His coat was classic black and tan, thick and weatherproof, with gray frosting around the muzzle that made his expression look permanently thoughtful. One ear tipped slightly, not floppy, just bent at the edge from some long-ago scuffle Frank never got the story for. His eyes were dark amber, steady and intelligent, the kind that seemed to measure rooms before Frank's brain finished naming them. Duke wore a simple working harness, not a flashy vest, because Frank didn't like attention, and Duke didn't need a costume to do his job. Even resting, the dog's posture held a quiet discipline, chin on paws, body angled so he could rise without scraping against the seat. Frank had met Duke at a county shelter 2 winters back, after he'd retired and the house had gotten too silent. He'd told himself it was just for company, for something to care for. But the truth had come in small humiliations, waking from nightmares with his fists clenched, standing in the kitchen at 3 a.m. hearing phantom radio chatter, flinching at the sudden slam of a cabinet door. Duke didn't fix those things. He just made them survivable. The dog would press his weight against Frank's shin as if anchoring him to the present, then look up with patient eyes that said, "You're here. That's enough." Frank's old SWAT teammates used to joke that he had 2 settings, polite and lethal. They weren't wrong. With strangers, he was reserved, courteous, the kind of man who held doors and said ma'am without thinking. In a crisis, he became something else, quiet, controlled, efficient. Retirement had not removed that part of him. It had simply taken away the legal justification to unleash it. That was the problem with being trained for storms. You didn't stop noticing the pressure changes. You just had fewer places to aim your attention. As the pickup crested a small rise, the town appeared ahead like a cluster of lights trapped in a snow globe. Willow Creek wasn't much. 1 main street, a diner, a hardware store, a feed shop, a small grocery that doubled as a post office. In summer, it smelled like pine and gasoline. In winter, it smelled like cold metal and wood smoke. Frank lived 10 miles out in a modest cabin he'd bought cheap after the heart surgery, the kind of place that didn't ask questions and didn't offer company. He made the drive into town once a week for groceries and once a month for prescriptions that kept his heart behaving. Today was the prescription day. His pill bottle had rattled empty that morning, the sound sharp in the quiet kitchen like a warning. He'd stared at it longer than he should have, remembering how, during his career, he'd never once forgotten to check a breaching charge or count his rounds. But now he could misplace the one thing that kept him from dropping in his own driveway. Aging, he'd learned, wasn't dramatic. It was a series of small betrayals. He pulled into the pharmacy lot, the tires crunching through fresh powder, and parked near the door to minimize walking on ice. Duke sat up immediately, ears forward, watching the street through the fogged rear window. "Stay," Frank said. The command was gentle, almost affectionate, but it carried the unmistakable tone of expectation. Duke's tail thumped once, slow. Frank stepped out into wind that slapped his face raw. The cold bit through his jacket seams and his breath formed a quick white bloom. He felt the familiar tightness at the center of his chest. Not pain, not exactly, but the reminder of the surgery and the limits it had carved into him. He flexed his fingers inside his gloves, checked his footing, and went inside. The pharmacy was warm and smelled of disinfectant and cinnamon gum. A tired-looking clerk with a red nose slid his bag across the counter with a practiced smile. Frank nodded thanks, said little, and left. On the way out, he glanced at the sky, gauging the storm's mood. The snow was coming harder now, wind whipping it sideways. Visibility was shrinking. He could have gone straight home. He should have gone straight home. But his pantry was thin, and the weather had that stubborn look that said roads might close by nightfall. He drove 2 blocks to the grocery, parked, and noticed something off the moment he stepped out. Music, loud enough to be rude, pulsed from somewhere nearby, deep bass rattling like an impatient heart. It didn't belong to Willow Creek. Town sounds were usually soft, a truck idling, a door chime, distant laughter that faded quickly. This sound was city loud, expensive loud. Frank's eyes tracked it the way they always had, and he saw the source. A glossy black SUV with tinted windows, angled crooked at the curb by the grocery entrance, its engine running, its headlights slicing through snow. The stereo thumped a rap beat that felt like it was trying to bully the storm into backing down. 3 young men spilled out, laughing, unsteady on their feet, shoulders hunched against the cold, but acting like it was a joke. They were in their early 20s, maybe, the age where consequences still seemed theoretical. Even at a distance, Frank could read money in the details. Brand new winter boots without scuff marks, a designer parka on one, a gold watch flashing from under a cuff, haircuts that required regular appointments. Their cheeks were flushed with alcohol and entitlement. The leader, tall, lean, with sandy blonde hair styled high and careless on purpose, moved with that practiced swagger of someone used to being deferred to. He had a clean jawline, no beard, and a smile that showed too many teeth. When he spoke, his voice carried like he expected the world to listen. The second guy was stockier, broad through the shoulders, dark hair cut close, a short beard that was more fashion than neglect. He laughed loudest, the kind of laugh that sought an audience. The third was lanky and twitchy, brown hair falling into his eyes, hands shoved deep in his pockets as if he wasn't sure what to do with them. He followed the other 2 half a step behind, glancing around like a man trying to enjoy himself while anticipating trouble. Frank didn't know. Their names didn't need to. He knew the type. He had arrested them in different bodies for decades. They hadn't evolved, just upgraded their clothes. Near the grocery entrance, partially sheltered by the awning, a woman in a wheelchair waited beside a closed service window. The store's neon open sign had been switched off, storm hours. A handwritten note taped to the glass read, "Closed early due to weather." The woman's shoulders were hunched against the cold, but her posture held a dignity that didn't bend easily. She looked about 30, with medium brown skin and expressive dark eyes that flashed with tired patience. Her hair was chestnut brown, pulled into a messy bun beneath a knit beanie, loose strands whipping free in the wind. She wore a long charcoal coat that covered her legs, and thick gloves gripped the wheel rims with practiced strength. A canvas tote bag hung from the back of her chair, the kind you'd use for art supplies or groceries, except it was empty. Now. Frank clocked the chair immediately. A lightweight model, good quality, customized with angled push rims, the sort that said she relied on it every day and had learned to make it an extension of herself. Beside her, sitting squarely on the snow-dusted sidewalk, was another German shepherd, slightly younger than Duke by the look of him, maybe 5 or 6, wearing a proper service harness. His coat was darker, more sable than tan, and his ears were upright spears. He didn't fidget, didn't sniff, didn't react to the bass. He watched the world with calm focus, close enough to touch her knee if he needed to. The woman, Emily Carter, as Frank would later learn, looked like someone who'd been forced to become tough in quiet ways. Not hardened, not cruel, but alert. The kind of alertness that comes from learning that help isn't always coming, and you'd better plan accordingly. She glanced at the young men and tightened her jaw, then turned her gaze away, a decision to be invisible. Frank recognized that choice too. It was the choice of someone who'd already done the math and didn't like the answer. The blonde leader spotted her and grinned like he'd found entertainment. "Hey," he called, dragging the word out as if talking to a child. "You stuck out here?" The stocky one laughed, nudged him. "Maybe she needs a push," he said, voice thick with mock helpfulness. The lanky one's smile faltered, and he glanced toward the street, uneasy. Emily didn't answer. She reached into her coat pocket and checked her phone, thumb moving fast, but the screen glare and snow made it hard to see. Her service dog leaned subtly closer, not aggressive, just present. The blonde leader stepped nearer, closing the distance that polite people leave. "Nice dog," he said, not admiring, more like appraising property. "That thing bite?" Emily's eyes flicked up, cool and direct. "He's working," she said, her voice calm but edged. "Please give us space." The blonde leader's smile tightened. Being corrected in public hit men like him like a slap. "Space?" he repeated, amused. "It's a sidewalk, in public." He leaned forward, invading her bubble, and Frank saw the shift in Emily's breathing, controlled but faster now. The service dog's ears angled forward, still no movement, discipline. "We're closed," a muffled voice called from inside the grocery, probably an employee hearing the commotion. "Folks, take it somewhere else." The stocky guy turned and slapped the glass with his palm, leaving a wet print. "Yeah? Open up," he yelled. "We need beer." The employee disappeared. The young men laughed. The blonde leader crouched slightly, bringing his face closer to Emily's eye level like he was doing her a favor. "Come on," he said, voice syrupy. "You can't even go in. That's rough." He shook his head as if pitying her, but his eyes glittered with something uglier. "Where's your ride? You got someone coming or you just out here?" Emily's cheeks flushed, whether from cold or humiliation, Frank couldn't tell. "Someone's coming," she said. "Back off." Frank felt his own pulse quicken, a low thrum behind his ribs. He told himself it was anger. It might have been fear, too. Fear of how easily a situation could tip, how fast cruelty could become violence when it found no resistance. He looked over his shoulder at his truck, at the back seat where Duke waited. Duke was still, watching. Frank could call out, could insert himself right now. He could also get Emily and her dog hurt worse if he escalated too quickly. Old instincts argued with new limitations. In SWAT, you didn't act on pride. You acted on advantage. Frank stepped closer, boots crunching in snow, and kept his voice level. "That's enough," he said, not loud, just firm. The 3 men turned. The blonde leader straightened, taking Frank in. He saw an older man, sturdy but not intimidating in a flashy way, a man in a plain winter jacket and work boots. He likely saw weakness, age, a slight stiffness in Frank's gait. He didn't see the years of doors breached, the nights spent keeping fear locked down so civilians could breathe. He didn't see the training that made Frank's hands hang loose at his sides, ready without advertising it. "Who are you?" the blonde asked, smiling like this was a game. Frank didn't answer the question. He shifted his stance so his body was between them and Emily, a small move that meant a lot. "Leave her alone," he said. "Store's closed. Roads are bad. Go home." The stocky one snorted. "Or what?" he said, stepping forward half a pace. Frank noticed the slight sway in his balance. Drunk. That made him unpredictable. The lanky one's eyes darted between Frank and Emily, and his throat bobbed as he swallowed. "Man, let's just go," he muttered, but the blonde ignored him. The blonde leader's smile widened, and he pointed at Frank's chest like he was making a joke at a bar. "Old man out here playing hero," he said. "This your girlfriend?" Emily's eyes narrowed. The service dog's tail stayed still, but his weight shifted, ready. Frank kept his voice calm because anger was a gift to men like this. "Last warning," Frank said. "Back away." The blonde's face hardened, and in that instant, Frank saw the same look he'd seen in 100 suspects, the calculation of how far they could push before someone pushed back. The blonde's gaze flicked past Frank to the street, to the empty sidewalk, to the snow that blurred the world into privacy. No witnesses, no consequence. He smiled again, smaller, meaner. "You gonna call the cops?" he asked. "Go ahead, I'll wait." Frank felt the old, bitter irony of it. He was the cops. He had been the cops. And right now, the badge in a drawer at home meant nothing. He heard a soft thump behind him as Emily's service dog rose from sitting to standing, placing himself closer to her chair. A living shield. The stocky guy noticed and laughed. "Oh, look," he said, voice mocking. "Dog thinks he's tough." He bent, scooped up a chunk of packed snow from the curb, and tossed it at the dog's face. The snow burst harmlessly, but it was a line crossed. Emily's voice snapped sharper. "Don't," she said. "Do not touch him." The blonde leader's eyes glittered. He stepped sideways, trying to get around Frank. Frank mirrored him, blocking. The blonde's shoulder bumped Frank's, deliberate. Frank's knee twinged with the shift, and he felt the sting of limitation like a slap. The blonde leaned close enough that Frank could smell whiskey and mint gum. "You're in the way," the blonde murmured. Frank's jaw tightened. "Then go around," he said. That's when the stocky one made his move. Quick, stupid, and cruel. He swung his boot not at Frank, but at the nearest soft target, Duke's counterpart, the service dog beside Emily. The dog tried to pivot, but the slick snow stole traction. The boot connected with the dog's ribs in a dull, sickening thud. The service dog yelped, a sharp sound that cut through the bass and wind. Emily made a sound too, small, broken, involuntary. Frank's body reacted before his mind finished deciding. He lunged, not to strike, but to shove the stocky man back. His shoulder hit the man's chest, and the man stumbled, arms windmilling. Pain flared in Frank's sternum, hot and immediate, and for a terrifying half-second, his vision blurred. The blonde leader's eyes widened, then he laughed, delighted. "Oh," he crowed, "he's got some fight." Frank steadied himself, breathing controlled through clenched teeth. He knew he was seconds from losing the advantage if his heart decided to misbehave. He also knew he couldn't let them keep kicking a dog and terrorizing a woman who couldn't simply stand up and walk away. He made the calculation he'd made 1,000 times. Protect the vulnerable first. Take the hit yourself if you have to, and don't let your ego write checks your body can't cash. "Emily," he said, guessing she needed her name to feel seen, even though he didn't know it yet. "Get your chair turned. Move away. Now." She blinked at him, startled that he addressed her like a person and not a problem. Her hands tightened on the rims. The blonde leader stepped forward fast, reaching toward her chair handle like he might grab it. Frank's voice dropped, dangerous in its quiet. "Don't," he said. The blonde paused, then smirked. "Or what, Grandpa?" The stocky one recovered his balance and spat onto the snow. "Let's teach him," he said. Frank heard Duke bark once from the truck, deep, a warning. The sound steadied Frank the way it always did. He didn't call Duke out, not yet. He needed one more second of control. The lanky one finally stepped back, fear creeping into his face as the situation tipped toward violence. "Seriously, man, this is dumb," he said, voice thinner. But the other two were past listening. The blonde leader's grin sharpened, and he looked from Frank to Emily and back, like he was choosing where to cause the most pain. Frank felt the storm press closer, snow thickening, the world narrowing to breath and boots and the faint metallic taste of adrenaline. He realized, with a cold clarity that made his stomach drop, that this was exactly the kind of moment retirement didn't protect you from. The moment when you had to decide whether you were still the man who stepped between monsters and victims, even if your heart might stutter under the load. He took a slow breath, anchoring himself the way Duke anchored him, and raised one hand. Not to fight, but to signal calm. "Walk away," he said again, steady as a gun barrel. "This ends right now." The blonde leader stared at him, then smiled like winter itself had taught. Him cruelty. "Make me," he said, and the stocky man shifted his weight, preparing to kick again. This time, not the service dog, but whoever was easiest. Frank moved without thinking, angling his body to take the hit if it came, and in that same instant, The wind gusted hard enough to rattle the awning above them, snow blasting across their faces. Emily's eyes squeezed shut against the sting, her breath catching. Frank's own eyes watered, and through the swirl he saw the stocky man's leg swing, saw the boot arc toward a dark shape that wasn't Emily's dog anymore, because Duke, his Duke, had exploded from the truck like a silent missile, harness snapping tight as Frank's forgotten leash line trailed behind him. Duke slammed into position in front of Frank and Emily, not biting, not lunging wildly, just planting himself as a wall of muscle and will. The boot connected with Duke's ribs instead, a brutal impact that made a sound Frank felt in his bones. Duke let out a strangled yelp and staggered, but he did not retreat. He lowered his head, eyes fixed on the attacker, a low rumble vibrating from his chest like thunder under ice. Frank's stomach dropped, rage and fear colliding. He heard himself say very softly, "You shouldn't have done that." And he knew, absolutely knew, that the storm was no longer the most dangerous thing on that street. The storm did not ease as Frank Walker drove away from the grocery store, only deepened, the snow growing heavier and the sky pressing lower, as if the town itself were being pushed down by weight it could no longer bear. Duke lay on his side in the back seat now, breathing shallowly, each rise of his rib cage uneven. His dark eyes were open but glassy, fixed not on the road but on Frank, tracking him with the same quiet trust he always had. Frank kept one hand on the wheel and one on the leash looped around his wrist, knuckles white, jaw locked so tight his teeth ached. The adrenaline had burned off quickly, leaving behind a colder, more dangerous thing, fear sharpened by responsibility. He drove straight to the only veterinary clinic in Willow Creek, a squat brick building with a flickering sign and a single light burning inside like a promise that hadn't yet given up. Dr. Helen Morris was waiting at the door when he skidded to a stop. She was in her late 40s, tall and angular, with steel gray hair pulled into a low ponytail that spoke of practicality rather than vanity. Her face was pale from long hours under fluorescent lights, her eyes sharp but kind behind rectangular glasses. She had been the town's vet for nearly 20 years, long enough to have patched up everything from frostbitten cattle to hunting dogs torn by barbed wire. People trusted her because she told the truth, even when it hurt. "Bring him in," she said, already moving, her voice calm in the way that steadied panic rather than dismissed it. Duke whimpered once as Frank lifted him, the weight heavier than it should have been, not just muscle and bone, but years of shared silence. Inside, the clinic smelled of antiseptic and wet fur. Dr. Morris worked with quick efficiency, fingers probing gently along Duke's ribs, her brow furrowing. "He's a tough one," she murmured, more to Duke than to Frank. X-rays confirmed what Frank already felt in his gut, a hairline fracture along two, ribs bruising deep enough to make breathing painful. "He needs to stay overnight," she said finally, meeting Frank's eyes. "Pain management, observation. If there's swelling, we need to catch it early." Frank nodded, the words landing heavier than they should have. Leaving Duke anywhere felt wrong, but he knew better than to argue with professionals. He rested his forehead briefly against Duke's, whispering something that wasn't quite words. Duke's tail thumped once, weak but loyal. Outside, Emily Carter waited in the wind, her wheelchair angled away from the door, her service dog gone now, likely taken by someone from the store who had seen enough to help. Emily's face was drawn tight, her dark eyes rimmed red, whether from cold or tears Frank couldn't tell. Up close, Frank noticed the faint scar along her jawline, old and healed, a reminder that life had already tested her more than once. She wrapped her arms around herself as Frank stepped out. "He's going to be okay," Frank said, because it mattered that someone said it, even if certainty was a luxury neither of them had. Emily nodded, swallowing hard. "Thank you," she said quietly. Her voice carried strength beneath the tremor. "For stepping in." Frank shook his head. "I should have done more," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Emily studied him for a moment, really looked at him, the stiffness in his posture, the care in his movements. "You did enough," she said. "Most people would have walked away." That was how they found themselves, minutes later, at the Willow Creek police station, a low concrete building with snow piled against its walls and a flag snapping violently on its pole. Inside, the warmth felt stale. Officer Mark Ellison sat behind the desk, shoulders hunched, a man in his early 40s with thinning brown hair and a face permanently set in weary lines. His uniform was clean but rumpled, his eyes tired in the way of someone who had learned to expect trouble and learned too well that effort didn't always change outcomes. He listened as Frank spoke, arms crossed loosely, nodding at the right moments, but never quite meeting Frank's gaze. Emily filled in details when Frank paused, her words precise, careful. Ellison typed slowly, the keys clicking too loud in the small room. When Frank finished, Ellison leaned back, exhaled through his nose. "Look," he said, choosing his words with deliberate caution. "We'll file the report, but those boys, their families got pull around here. Businesses, donations, that sort of thing. These things take time." Frank felt something cold settle in his chest. He recognized the language instantly, the softening phrases that meant nothing would happen unless someone forced it. "They assaulted a woman and kicked a service dog," Frank said evenly. "That's not complicated." Ellison's mouth tightened. "I'm not saying it's right," he replied. "I'm saying it's how it is." Emily's hands clenched on her chair's rims. "So what are we supposed to do?" she asked. Ellison shrugged, a small, helpless motion. "Stay available. If we need more statements, we'll call." The meeting ended the way Frank had known it would, with paper shuffled and promises left intentionally vague. Outside, the storm swallowed the building whole. Emily pulled her coat tighter. "I'll head home," she said, though there was little confidence in the words. Frank watched her go, the tracks of her wheels already disappearing under fresh snow, and felt the old, familiar anger burn low and steady. He drove home alone that night, the cabin greeting him with cold silence. Duke's blanket lay folded by the door, unused. Frank sat at the kitchen table longer than he should have, staring at his hands, seeing in them not age but restraint, and wondering when restraint had become permission. The phone rang just after 9. The sound cut through the quiet like a blade. Frank answered on the second ring. "Walker," he said. "Still answering like you're on call," came a gravelly voice edged with dry humor. It was Jack Monroe, Frank's former SWAT partner, retired 5 years before Frank and twice as bitter about it. Jack was built like a retired linebacker, thick through the chest even now, his beard a riot of gray that he never bothered trimming neatly. Years ago, a botched operation had cost Jack a teammate, and the loss had carved something hard into him that never softened. "I heard about the incident," Jack continued. "Word travels." Frank closed his eyes briefly. "Then you know enough." "Enough to say this isn't random," Jack replied. "That family's been pulling this kind of thing for years. Lawyers first, intimidation second, property damage if needed. They don't like noise." Frank's grip tightened on the phone. "Emily's already shaken," he said. "Duke's hurt." Jack was quiet for a beat. "That's how they work," he said finally. "They don't need to win in court if they win in your head." When the call ended, Frank sat in the dark, the weight of the day pressing in. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows like a warning. Somewhere across town, Duke lay in a sterile cage, trusting Frank to come back. Somewhere else, Emily sat alone, wondering how much more the world planned to take from her. Frank rose slowly, joints protesting, and stood at the window. The snow erased tracks quickly, but he knew better than to believe storms erased intentions. Justice hadn't failed yet, he told himself. It had only hesitated. And hesitation, he knew from long experience, was often the most dangerous moment of all. Morning came late and gray, the storm loosening its grip but not its threat, the sky still low and bruised as if winter had unfinished business. Frank Walker woke before dawn out of habit, his body trained for alarms that no longer rang. The cabin was cold, despite the fire he'd banked the night before, and for a disorienting second, he expected to hear Duke's nails clicking across the floor. The absence landed hard. Frank sat on the edge of the bed, shoulders rounded, listening to the quiet and feeling the ache in his chest ease into a dull reminder rather than a warning. He dressed slowly, favoring his knee, and poured black coffee he barely tasted. Outside, the world looked scrubbed raw by snow. The road was still officially open, but only barely, and Frank knew better than to push it. He was still staring out the window when his phone buzzed. It was a text from the veterinary clinic. "Duke stable. Breathing improved. Call when you can. Frank let out a breath he hadn't realized. He was holding and texted back a simple thanks. 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time it was Emily Carter. Her voice when he answered sounded smaller than it had the night before, tight with exhaustion. "Frank," she said, skipping pleasantries. "Someone called me this morning, a lawyer." Frank closed his eyes. What did he want? "To help," Emily replied, the word edged with disbelief. She explained in clipped sentences how the man had introduced himself as Arthur Hale, legal counsel for the family of the young men from the night before. Hale's voice, she said, had been smooth and unhurried, cultured in a way that felt practiced. He spoke as if they were discussing an unfortunate scheduling conflict rather than assault. He offered to cover all veterinary expenses for Duke and her service dog, compensation for emotional distress, even replacement costs for anything damaged, provided she signed a non-disclosure agreement. No police reports, no social media, no further discussion. "And when I said no," Emily continued, her breath catching, "he told me to think carefully. He mentioned my landlord by name. He said it would be a shame if my lease situation became complicated." Frank's jaw tightened. He could picture Hale easily without ever meeting him. Mid-50s, tailored suit, hair just starting to silver at the temples, the kind of man who never raised his voice because he never needed to. Men like that didn't threaten directly. They implied futures. "Did he put anything in writing?" Frank asked. "Not yet," Emily said. "He said he'd have something sent over later today, like he was doing me a favor." Frank stood, the chair legs scraping softly against the floor. "Listen to me," he said, keeping his voice level. "Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. And if anyone shows up at your place, you call me. Immediately." Emily hesitated. "Frank, they know where I live. They know things." "So do I," Frank said, though the words tasted thin even as he spoke them. After the call ended, Frank drove into town as soon as the roads allowed, tires crunching over packed ice. He stopped first at the veterinary clinic. Dr. Helen Morris met him with a tired smile. Duke lay on a blanket in a kennel, bandaged around the ribs, eyes lifting as Frank approached. His tail wagged weakly, but the light in his gaze was steady. Frank crouched with a grunt, resting his hand on Duke's neck, feeling the warmth and the familiar solidity. "You did good," he murmured. Dr. Morris straightened beside him. "He's lucky," she said, "and stubborn, like his owner." Frank almost smiled. From there, he went straight to Emily's building, a converted warehouse near the edge of town, all exposed brick and tall windows that bled cold. Emily answered the door herself, bundled in layers. In daylight, the place told a quiet story. Canvases stacked neatly along one wall, a drafting table scarred with use, jars of brushes cleaned and arranged with care. Emily herself looked thinner than Frank remembered from the night before, her face pale against the dark knit cap she still wore indoors. She moved with efficient confidence in her chair, the kind born from long practice, but there was tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. "I keep replaying it," she admitted, wheeling closer, thinking if I'd just stayed quiet. Frank shook his head. "That's how they win," he said. They talked for nearly an hour, going over details Frank already suspected mattered. License plates, times, what was said and by whom. Emily was precise, her memory sharp despite the fear gnawing at her. Frank admired that. It took strength to remember clearly when forgetting would be easier. When he left, he made her promise again to call him if anything felt off. He was halfway home when Jack Monroe called back. "You hear from their lawyer yet?" Jack asked without preamble. "Emily did," Frank replied. Jack snorted. "Right on schedule." He explained what Frank already knew but needed confirmed. In nearby counties, similar patterns had played out. Harassment, legal pressure, sudden inspections, mysteriously broken locks. "They don't care about winning cases," Jack said. "They care about teaching lessons." That afternoon, the lesson came faster than Frank expected. He was back at the clinic checking on Duke when his phone rang again, Emily's name flashing insistently. When he answered, her voice was no longer tight. It was hollow. "Frank," she whispered, "they were here." His stomach dropped. "Where are you?" "Outside," she said. "I went to the supply store 2 blocks away. I was gone 20 minutes. When I came back..." Her words dissolved into a breathless sound. Frank didn't wait for more. He drove, heart pounding harder than it had any right to, praying the storm hadn't closed the Roads again. Emily's building smelled wrong the moment he entered. Not oil paint and wood, but something sharp and chemical. Spray paint. The studio was wrecked. Canvases slashed clean through the center, frames snapped, jars of pigment smashed against the walls, colors bleeding together into ugly smears. The drafting table lay overturned, one leg splintered. On the far wall, in dripping red letters, someone had written a message large enough to dominate the room. "Next time, it's the dog." Emily sat frozen in her chair in the middle of it all, hands limp in her lap, eyes fixed on the words as if they might move. Frank crossed the room slowly, careful not to startle her. "Emily," he said softly. She didn't respond. He crouched until they were eye level. "Look at me." Her gaze flickered, then focused, and tears finally spilled, silent and relentless. "They took everything," she whispered. "My work, my life." Frank felt something old and cold settle into place, a focus he hadn't felt since retirement. This was no longer intimidation. This was escalation. He straightened, scanning the room with a professional eye. The main door locks were intact, the windows unbroken. They'd come in through the side delivery entrance. Smart, practiced. He thought of Officer Ellison's tired shrug, of Arthur Hale's polite menace. "We're not staying here tonight," Frank said firmly. Emily looked up, confused. "What?" "Pack essentials," he said. "Clothes, documents, laptop, we're leaving." "Where?" "Somewhere they don't expect." He helped her gather what little remained untouched, his movements efficient, controlled. As they left, Frank took one last look at the message on the wall. He didn't feel fear. He felt resolve. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, light but steady, covering tracks as quickly as they were made. Frank knew better than to believe it erased anything. It only hid it. And hidden things, he knew from long experience, were often the most dangerous of all. The motel sat off Highway 12 like a thought no one finished. A low concrete strip with a flickering vacancy sign and parking spaces half buried under plowed snow. Frank chose it because it was forgettable. No character, no charm, no reason for anyone with money or pride to ever notice it. He paid cash under his own name anyway, daring the world to object, and pushed Emily's wheelchair through the narrow door while the heater rattled like it had asthma. The room smelled faintly of bleach and old fabric softener. It was clean enough. It was quiet. That was what mattered. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, her hands still shaking, eyes dull with shock. In the harsh yellow light, Frank noticed new details. Faint freckles across her nose, a thin scar on her left wrist she kept unconsciously rubbing, the way her jaw tightened whenever she tried not to cry. She looked exhausted in a way sleep would not fix. "You're safe here," Frank said, not as reassurance but as instruction. Check the locks, then the window, then the hallway sightline out of habit. Emily nodded, but her gaze kept drifting to the door, as if expecting it to burst open. Frank left her with his spare phone number written on a receipt and drove back into the storm before she could argue. He went straight to the veterinary clinic. Duke lifted his head when Frank entered, tail thumping weakly against the blanket. His ribs were wrapped now, the bandage stark white against dark fur, his breathing still shallow but steady. Frank rested his palm on Duke's shoulder, grounding himself in the warmth. "We're not done yet," he murmured. Duke's ears flicked, as if he understood more than words could carry. Frank signed the discharge papers and brought Duke home, setting him up on the rug near the fireplace where he could rest without strain. Only then did Frank allow himself to sit, the adrenaline finally draining away, leaving behind a bone-deep fatigue. He knew exhaustion was dangerous. It made men sloppy. And sloppiness in situations like this got people hurt. He reached for his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. Laura Reyes answered on the third ring. "You don't call unless it matters," she said, voice sharp and alert. Laura was in her early 40s, compact and athletic, with dark hair cut short for convenience rather than style. Frank remembered her as a patrol officer with quick instincts and a spine made of steel. He'd once pulled her out of a hallway that went bad, and she'd never forgotten it. Now she worked state-level investigations, the kind that didn't bend easily to local pressure. Frank explained everything, from the grocery store to the message on the wall. Laura listened without interrupting. When he finished, there was a brief silence. "You're right," she said finally. "This is organized, and they're escalating." "I don't want revenge," Frank replied. "I want proof." Laura exhaled slowly. "Then we are and do this clean. No heroics. You give me a location where they'll feel comfortable crossing a line." Frank's gaze drifted to the ruined studio in his mind, to the side delivery entrance, the blind spot the attackers had used. "I have a place," he said. They met the next morning at the old warehouse complex behind Emily's building. The snow had eased into a thin, steady fall, quieting the world. Laura arrived in an unmarked sedan, dressed plain, her movements efficient. She walked the site with Frank, eyes sharp, absorbing details. "They'll come back," she said. "People like this don't like unfinished business." Frank nodded. "They think she's broken," he replied. "They'll want confirmation." The plan came together in measured steps. Frank installed discrete cameras and motion sensors inside the unused storage area connected to the side entrance, equipment he still had boxed away from another life. Laura arranged for state units to be on standby, far enough away not to spook anyone, close enough to move fast. Duke was settled at Frank's cabin, resting nowhere near the trap. That mattered to Frank more than anything. Night fell early. The temperature dropped hard, the kind of cold that made metal ache. Frank waited alone in the darkened storage space, seated against a concrete pillar, breath slow, listening to the building's small sounds. He wasn't hunting. He was observing. Years ago, he'd learned that the most dangerous men weren't the loud ones, but the confident ones, the ones who believed the world would step aside for them. Headlights cut through the snow outside shortly after midnight. Voices followed, muffled, careless. Frank didn't need to see their faces to know them. He watched the door handle turn, the lock give way. Cameras captured everything. The men moved inside, laughing softly, unaware of how exposed they were. Frank stayed still, invisible, until the moment mattered, when Laura's voice crackled, quietly through his earpiece. "We have enough?" Frank rose, stepping into the edge of light just long enough to draw attention, just long enough to confirm identity and intent. Panic followed, clumsy and loud. Sirens cut through the night moments later, red and blue reflecting off snow like blood on ice. Frank stepped back into shadow, heart pounding but steady, knowing this part was no longer his to handle. By dawn, it was over. Dawn crept in pale and hesitant, a thin wash of light over snow that had finally stopped falling, leaving the world hushed as if it were holding its breath. Frank Walker stood just outside the warehouse doors, his breath fogging the air, shoulders heavy with exhaustion that felt earned rather than hollow. The night had unfolded exactly as planned, and nothing like he had imagined during the long hours of waiting. State troopers moved with controlled efficiency around the scene, their dark uniforms stark against the white ground, voices low, purposeful. Laura Reyes emerged from the building, her short dark hair tucked beneath a knit cap, her expression composed but satisfied. She looked like a woman who carried responsibility lightly because she trusted her own spine. "We got them," she said simply. Breaking and entering, vandalism, criminal intimidation, cameras caught everything, messages, tools, faces. Frank nodded, the words settling slowly. He felt no rush of triumph, no hunger for spectacle. Only relief, measured and steady. The young men were led out one by one, hands cuffed, bravado gone, faces pale and tight with the first real taste of consequence. Without their expensive coats and confident laughter, they looked younger than Frank remembered, small in a way that made their cruelty seem even more obscene. One of them glanced at Frank as he passed, eyes wide with disbelief, as if trying to reconcile the quiet, gray-haired man with the end of his immunity. Frank did not meet his gaze. He had learned long ago that eye contact in moments like this gave men the illusion of meaning. He had no interest in offering it. By mid-morning, the scene was cleared, statements taken, evidence secured. Laura lingered only long enough to clasp Frank's forearm in a brief, firm grip. "You did this the right way," she said. "Most don't." Frank shrugged slightly. "I've seen what happens when you don't," he replied. The drive back to the motel felt shorter than it should have. Emily Carter sat by the window when Frank knocked, her posture rigid until she recognized him through the glass. She opened the door herself, eyes searching his face before he could speak. "It's done," Frank said quietly. The words seemed to take a moment to land. Emily sank back into her chair, one hand covering her mouth as a breath she'd been holding for days finally escaped. She didn't cry right away. Instead, she laughed once, a small, disbelieving sound that carried more release than humor. "They're not coming back?" she asked. "No," Frank said, "they won't." Emily's shoulders sagged, tension draining from her frame in visible waves. In the clearer light of morning, Frank saw the strength that had been there all along, buried under fear and fatigue. She straightened slowly, wiping at her eyes. "Thank you," she said again, and this time the words carried weight rather than desperation. They drove together to the veterinary clinic later that afternoon. Duke was waiting, alert now, bandage clean, tail thumping with more conviction than the day before. Dr. Helen Morris handed over instructions in her brisk, no-nonsense way, eyes flicking between Frank and Emily with quiet approval. Duke leaned into Frank's leg when he stood, solid and warm, a living proof that some things endured. Back at Frank's cabin, the fire crackled, filling the space with a warmth that felt almost luxurious after days of tension. Emily sat at the small kitchen table, wrapped in a blanket, sipping soup Frank had heated without comment. Duke lay nearby, breathing deep and even. The silence between them was no longer sharp or fearful. It was companionable, the kind earned through shared ordeal. Emily spoke first. "I thought if I stayed quiet, if I didn't make trouble, the world would be easier," she said softly. "I was wrong." Frank watched the flames dance. "Quiet isn't the same as weak," he said. "But silence doesn't protect you from people who want to hurt." She nodded, absorbing that, and for the first time since he'd met her, Frank saw a hint of calm settle into her expression. Evening brought news from Laura by text, charges filed, lawyer pressure neutralized, the family's influence blunted by evidence too public to bury. Frank read it once, then set the phone aside. He had no need to savor it. Later, as the sky darkened and the cabin windows reflected firelight, Frank sat in his old armchair, Duke's head resting against his knee, Emily sketching quietly at the table with borrowed paper and pencil. The strokes were tentative at first, then more confident, as if reclaiming something that had been taken. Frank realized, with a clarity that surprised him, that this quiet restoration, was the real ending. Not the arrests, not the sirens, but the return of ordinary moments. When Emily finally looked up, she smiled, small and genuine. "I think," she said, "I can sleep tonight." Frank nodded. "Me too." Outside, winter still ruled the land, cold and indifferent, but inside the cabin, the storm had passed. In moments like these, we are reminded that God often works in ways that are quiet and unseen. He does not always arrive with thunder or spectacle, but through steady hands, faithful hearts, and the courage to stand when walking away would be easier. Scripture tells us that the Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and this story reflects that truth through ordinary people who choose to do what is right. Frank did not act out of hatred or revenge. He acted with restraint, integrity, and a sense of duty shaped by a lifetime of hard lessons. In our own lives, we may never face dangers this dramatic, but we are tested every day in smaller ways, when we speak up for someone who is vulnerable, when we refuse to stay silent in the face of wrongdoing, or when we choose compassion over comfort. God calls us to be light in dark places, not through force, but through faithfulness. This story reminds us that quiet courage, guided by faith, can change the course of another person's life. If this message spoke to your heart, please share it with someone who may need encouragement today. We invite you to leave a comment and tell us what this story meant to you, and if you believe in the power of faith, justice, and love lived out in everyday actions, consider subscribing to our channel so you can continue to be part of a community that seeks hope, strength, and purpose together. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide your steps, and thank you so much for watching.